Yes, sir, baby. It is that time again. We are tier listing all Call of Duty pros heading into COD Champs. Obviously, Stage 5 lived up to the hype. It was insane, to say the least. And the Stage 5 Major, of course, with fans back, the Ultra Reverse Sweep in the Grand Finals, and all the storylines. And so that creates for a pretty spicy time to tier list all the Call of Duty pros. And today we're actually changing up the format a little bit from what we did before. Probably, hopefully, kind of invigorating it a little bit, spicing it up a little bit, and making it a little bit more interesting as well. So we have a lot to talk about today. So without further ado, let's get right into this one. Let's go. So of course, as every stage passes, we learn more and more about these players and about these teams. I mean, think about it, like every stage, because teams don't stream scrims anymore, we're not seeing these players play very often. Like, you're learning a lot more about all of these teams throughout every single match. I mean, Paris, for example, only played 30 matches this year. So in stage 5, their 5 matches, that's like 15-16% of their whole year's worth of play. And so you can learn a lot about these teams even at the ends of the year like this, or about individuals and about how these certain players play. And so we have a lot to talk about all of these guys and the improvements that they make heading into champs, and what this means for all of these guys moving forward. And like I said, a new format as well. So there's 2 big changes to how we're doing this. The first one is basically to kind of smooth the process up and make it go a little bit faster. Generally, these videos get a little bit too lengthy and long. The first thing is that we're going to be showing all of the players that aren't changing their tiers. So I actually pre-tier listed this, and we're going to talk through them with some of the guys, the spicy ones that are kind of a little bit more controversial, and talk about those guys first, and then we'll go through the guys individually who change tiers and talk about those guys specifically. So it should be really fun. And the other thing is that we're not going to have the numbered tiers this time, but we're still going to be staying true to keeping it as close as possible. We may be switching up a little bit, but we're going to be a little bit more lenient with ourselves with where we're putting these guys, to hopefully make it a little bit more accurate, more interesting, and create some better conversation as well. And the last thing for this long intro that you already know, though, is how we rank these guys. And this is always really important for the context for the conversation, is we rank these guys based off of their past performance, but we're looking forward to the upcoming event. So we're ranking these guys for COD Champs, or before COD Champs. And basically how you can think about it is, the higher that these guys are on the list would be the more likely that I would be to pick these guys to create a super team to win COD Champs. So we're just talking about these guys as abilities, as individuals, and projecting that a little bit towards the next few weeks heading into COD Champs as well. So it should be a blast, and now we can finally get into talking about these players. So for some context, here is the rankings from the last video. And so there were obviously some guys that I didn't feel too good about, like the Dallas players were specifically one that I highlighted in the video that I didn't love their rankings. Like Crim was in the C tier, which I did not like at all. And actually in the pinned comment on the last video, I wanted to move him up into the B tier because it didn't feel good having Crim in the C tier. And then even some of the other Dallas guys like Crim, like Illy and Vivid, and those guys didn't feel too good about Bance. I mean, those guys are all so good, and tier ranking these guys is incredibly tough in itself. And so it's always insane seeing how much talent there is, even in the D and E tiers, with how talented those guys are. It's always crazy in both my mind. So with that in mind, now we can kind of show the players who did not change tiers in heading into this video. So here's all the players that didn't change tiers, and off the rip you can tell that there's a lot of guys in the S tier who didn't change. And of course that really centers around the FaZe guys. All 4 FaZe guys are still in the S tier this time around. And I mean, obviously I could see the argument that some might have for not having all 4 of them in the S tier, considering that they've been struggling a little bit more than normal lately. But at the end of the day, I don't think that their struggles as a team is because of the lack of individual talent, which is what we're tier listing. They just didn't play very well as a squad, as a unit. The communication and the patience just wasn't there. The last few matches, they've lost 3 of their last 4, obviously losing both at the stage 5 major on LAN. And just some of that has broken down a little bit for them, and it hasn't come through as cleanly as it was before. But at the end of the day, I still think that all of those guys are insanely talented, are deserving players to be on a tier list like this inside the S tier for sure. So the other guys there, obviously Shotzi and Hydra, insanely talented, and Hydra continues to show out as about as good of a player as you can get in the CDL. Again, there are a few matches where you're like, oh man, that wasn't it. And like specifically like the APOC against LAG where he didn't play very well, and some of the other ones like that. But as a whole, Hydra has done so much for that New York team on the year. And even when they haven't been playing as well, he still makes some insane plays that bail him out. Like he pops a 3-piece or finds a 2-piece in S&D that bails them out to win them rounds or win them hills. And Hydra's insane. And even for Shotzzy, who probably had his worst event since like the beginning of Modern Warfare, like the first or second event of the year, where he really struggled on land before he figured it out at like CDL Los Angeles when they won that on land. But Shotzzy had a really tough event. So I could also see someone arguing that, okay, right now, maybe he's not S tier, but I still think that on an individual level, Shotzi's insanely talented, and he'd be a guy that I would want on my squad for champs. So in the A tier, Cammy, Kleenex, and Skies, I would imagine people would probably still be a little bit hesitant about Skies being in the A tier, but I'm gonna double and triple down that Skies is about as good as it gets in the CDL. He's insanely talented. And again, he brings so much energy to a team. His comms are as electric as almost anyone in the CDL. Criticism that we saw during stage 5 was that he can talk over his teammates. We heard that from, I think it was Miles maybe who said that on the broadcast. And I could maybe see that. Again, Skies' natural ability as a player is insane. And I think he's just really, really good. As for Cammy and Kleenex, those two guys, again, so valuable to what Toronto does. And again, Toronto as a team, they're so good. They bring so much to the table, and they're just fantastic players, and that's why they're in the A tier for sure. Down to the B tier, Neptune, Gunless, Formal, and Kenny. So obviously, I think the first person that would stand out there would be Formal, considering he had a lackluster stage 5, especially a lackluster stage 5 major, and then especially a lackluster stage 5 major final series and final map on Checkmate where he went 8-25. But Formal is still a fantastic player, and he not only that, but he's a great in-game leader for Optic. Yes, he has struggled in S&D at points throughout the year, but he's still insanely clutch, and he definitely still has a gunny, and those things for sure can keep him inside the B tier. Neptune, I could see an argument maybe for him being higher on the list, but because of how talented some of the other guys in the A tier are, that's why I kept him inside the B tier. Same with Gunless and Kenny, both fantastic players. We all know how good those guys are, and they can be valuable assets to a championship team for sure. So down in the C tier, we got Pristini, Havoc, Vivid, and Illy. And so again, Vivid and Illy were really tough for me to kind of like decide if I wanted to put them in the B tier or the C tier. They were right on the fringe of that tier for sure. I'd be totally fine with somebody having them in the B tier. When you see some of the other guys that are going to be inside the B tier, you'll be like, yeah, I mean, it's stacked. We're still looking for a little bit more of that consistency. Again, we saw those flash moments from both Illy and Vivid at different times throughout stage 5, even at the major, where both of them had some massive maps. And so I could see that for sure. Same with Pristini and Havoc though, where they've had moments where they've been unbelievable. And like when people, including myself, were insanely high on Florida, was because it was coming off of Havoc having some of the best series of his life during stage 5. And so that's where like some of like the hesitation and surprise came for when he didn't perform very well at the major. And Florida, of course, played really, really bad, lost to New York, and that sucked. And then Pristini, again, shocker, had some awesome moments throughout the major, of course, with their wins on LAN again and Seattle's performance there. I could see somebody having him maybe in the B tier, but C tier feels about right for Pristini right now as well. And then down to the D tier, you got some of the Paris guys like Scraps and Temp. You've got Paul X and Classic. And so, first of all, Paul X is a really interesting one because we've seen the upside of him as a player where there are moments, especially in S&D, where he takes over and dominates. And so he has the upside to be an elite player in the CDL. The inconsistencies with London as a team makes it hard to grade those guys on a game-to-game basis. Again, we've seen the potential for what Paul X can be, and the response has been where it's been pretty inconsistent for Paul. And so if he can start figuring out and ironing out those respawns and really dialing into the positioning and helping his teammates and finding those kills like that, I think Paul could skyrocket up the rankings here tier in the off season or heading into the next game as well, into whatever, Vanguard or whatever it is down the road too. So we'll see what happens with that. Scraps in temp and classic. Obviously, Nikki D had an insane LAN performance, beating FaZe, of course, and Nikki D was a big reason why. He was in the D tier before, but now he's at the top of the D tier, and Nikki D can still be a very important piece to a very good team in the CDL, but it's been a tough road for him, of course, throughout the year, but you gotta love seeing him fry on land, to say the least. So down in the E tier, we've got Assault, Shawnee, and Alex. For Alex, it's been really tough go since he came back after the absence of leaving London for a while, not playing COD for a while. There's been a few series where he's looked really good, but for the most part, it's been a big time struggle for him, and there's no consistency whatsoever, especially against some of the better teams in the CDL. And then as for Shawnee and Assault, AR players, and generally I like to lower the AR players on the list a little bit. I generally value the SMGs a little bit higher. So Assault and Shawnee just end up a little bit lower on the list here. So that does it for all the players who are in the same categories last time. So now let's get into the juice of it, and let's talk about some of the players who are in different categories. So off the rip, we are starting off with Benjamin Bance. And Benjamin Bance is now in the B tier category. So before, he was in the C tier, and I absolutely hated that because of how much I love this Toronto team this year, with the fundamentals that they play with, the communication, the leadership ability that Bance brings to the table, and overall how they're put together as a team. I freaking love it. And the fact that I wasn't able to get Bance in the B tier before was really frustrating. And so, that's why there was just those things where I'm like, man, Bance is at least a B tier player. I really think he's good in Black Ops Cold War. And I wanted to get him up there in the B tier. So Bance is there. I think he brings a lot to that Toronto squad, and definitely a deserving B tier player. So John is actually up next, and he wasn't in the last tier list video, actually. Of course, that was before one of the mini LAT roster changes. And I have John in the C tier right now. To be fair, John has been a little bit underwhelming coming in. I was really hoping he'd come in and take the CDL by storm. There is still an upside for John in that heading into champs, and that there's a world where, John and this LAT team makes a run at champs, and then suddenly we're looking at this squad in a whole different lens and heading into roster mania. But right now, I think John's probably pretty easily sitting in that C tier player, where we saw him tear it up in the amateur scene. He's come in now to the CDL, and he's had some nice moments, but hasn't really been able to piece it together consistently. And we're still waiting to see that, and maybe that's where it'll happen at champs. So we'll just have to see. But I still think there's a lot of optimism or a lot of upside here for John heading into the offseason as well. So Big Wake is the next guy up, and I actually dropped him down to the B tier. So he was in the A tier before, and obviously Florida's had some frustrations, of course, with their team in stage 5 and the ups and downs, the inconsistencies. And so Awakening has definitely not been playing his best COD, and that's something that I'm really high on Awakening, and I think a lot of people have been high on Awakening, and maybe that's kind of fallen off a little bit here as they've struggled as a team. And Awakening hasn't had those dominant take over the game performances like he had earlier in the year. And this is something that we talked about on the podcast. I talked about in the breakdown video on Monday as well, just about the fact that teams, earlier on in the years don't have that teamwork down and don't understand the spawns as well. And so that individual play and relying on that individual talent can actually work out a lot better earlier on in the year. And then as the year goes along, because you're playing against the same 12 teams throughout the whole year and the same COD pros for the most part throughout the whole year. And so slowly but surely, teams or players start figuring you out and figuring out the tendencies of the individuals. And then you've really got to develop that teamwork as a team, those communication and those fundamental team aspects to fall back on later in the year. And it hasn't really come through. And I thought that maybe Florida would be able to develop that a little bit better. And by stage 5 or, heading into this major, I had a lot of high hopes for them to make a run, and it just was not the case. And so I felt like I had to drop somebody down, and that ended up being Awakening. So the next guy up is a very interesting player. And this is the guy who was in the D tier in the last tier list video, but now he's in the C tier. And this is a guy who could easily fly up the board here in the off season, or especially heading into next year. And that's Afro for the London Royal Ravens. Afro has been awesome, and I was tempted to put him higher on the list, but I couldn't get myself to do it. But I know there's gonna be some of you European fans, some of you London fans out there that would want to see Afro in that B tier at least, considering the upside and the flashiness that we've seen from him in some of these matches with London during stage 5. And it's been really, really impressive to say the least. I mean, he has made some insanely awesome plays, popped a few 3-pieces or 4-pieces or got on streaks where you're like, yo, Afro's nuts. And those things get me really, really excited about his future. And I cannot wait to see what he does heading into next year. And so we'll talk a lot more about him probably in the final tier list video heading into Roster Mania here in a few weeks. But yeah, he's awesome. And I'm really, really excited about Afro moving forward, to say the least. So the next player is very interesting. He's a guy that has been kind of all over the tier list this year. At the beginning of the year, he might have even been in the S tier. And then at one point, maybe he dropped down to the B tier, maybe even a C tier. I can't even remember. But Octane has had quite the year, and I have him in the A tier again with land back. Octane, you know, sometimes you forget once in a while how good Octane can be. And when Seattle's really frying and playing their best, Octane's generally a big reason why. And Octane just so happens to be really, really good at Call of Duty. Again, he is a main AR, so that always can get tough with how that plays out once in a while. But yeah, I have so much faith in Octane as a Call of Duty player with how good he is. He brings so much to the team, not just in slang, not just in the gun skill, not just in the positioning, but also in the energy, the leadership. And he can pop that 2-piece, 3-piece at any point to win a spawn or win a rotation for you. Octane's a fantastic player, and he's in the A tier for sure. So the next player is one guy I was really pissed about in the last tier list video, because I had him in the C tier where most of the year he was in the A tier in my tier list videos almost the whole time. And I had really been talking this guy up and how good he's been, how icy he has been. And then even RCDs came on 1v1 me, bro, and we talked about it with him about how icy this player is. And that's Attach. I had him in the C tier in the last video, and I'm like, I was pissed. I was so mad that I decided to put him in the C tier because I know how good this guy has been. And again, like I said, he was in the A tier almost the whole year. I dropped him down because there was a big time struggle for Attach throughout stage 4. And there was a little bit of a lull there for him and for the whole Rocker team after they brought in Standy, and then they bring in Major Maniac, and it wasn't going very well for him. And then they come out here and they freaking win stage 5. So with all that said, Attach is back in the A tier, man. He is a unit, and I'm so mad that I had him in the C tier before. He's a beast. He's clutch. He's nasty. He can do it all. He's a leader. He's as good of a leader as there is in the CDL. And he just truly does it all for the Rocker. And I really just do think Attach is an absolute unit. So he's in the A tier for sure. He's a beast. And next up is another guy, again, back-to-back guys who I was pissed about in the tier list. Like I mentioned earlier, Crimsix was in the C tier last time, which I immediately regretted, like I said, and put him in the pinned comment. I wanted to move him up back to the B tier. And so he's officially back in the B tier in this video. Crim has been playing really, really, really well. He's continued to improve this year. Earlier on, I had some doubts about whether or not Crim was actually good at this game or not. And he has definitely rebounded, figured things out, and he's playing some really, really good Call of Duty right now. And heading into champs, would it be surprising at all if Crim and that squad clutch up and make a run and end up winning COD champs? Definitely not. And Crim's at least a B tier player. He is fantastic. So next up's the guy who was in the A tier in the last video, and he's consistently been pretty high up on these lists throughout the year. And he's had his time in the S tier as well. And when you look at that, he has returned to his rightful spot in the S tier, and that's Dashy. So I mean, Dashy's a guy who about has as much upside as anybody in the CDL. And it feels like at moments he just kind of turns on the cheat code and turns on like the invincibility cheat code and becomes unkillable. He'll go on these insane like 10 kill streaks or whatever it is and start frying, and you're like, yo, what is this? And so he has as much upside as anybody in the CDL. Dashy is insane, and he's been so consistent for Optic on the year, where most of this year he has been very, very good and really reliable with the Krig, the XM4, whatever it is, and throughout the year just played really, really good Call of Duty. Dashy is fantastic. So the next player up is Aqua, and he was in the C tier in the last video. In this video, I decided to move him back down to the D tier here. Overall, just a little bit disappointing from Paris in this stage, where I really thought they might be on the uptrend and potentially, you know, making some sort of run here at stage 5. But overall, the play from just all of the whole squad which is pretty disappointing. That's why we kind of see them all pretty low here. It always feels like there's some sort of untapped potential with Aqua at moments where, you know, we see the split seconds of like big time gunfights and nasty play, and then it kind of drops back down, the inconsistencies game mode to game mode. I think Aqua can be a really important player on a great team. So I think moving forward is kind of to see what Aqua can do. I know we saw some of those tweets from him about the potential of not finding a team next year, or he's not going to be begging for a team or whatever. So I hope he can find a team next year, because I would really like to see a guy like him continue to keep playing the CDL, because he can definitely make it happen for sure. Next up is a guy who wasn't actually on the last list either, and that's a player who replaced Chino on LAG. And Mental is pretty tough to grade considering we haven't seen like a ton of him yet. We saw the best we'd seen of him in that the Apocalypse hardpoint against New York, and he made some big time plays like down inside dark on Apocalypse, and I was really impressed with that. But I haven't seen enough of him to be convinced that he should be higher right now than the E tier. Obviously new into the CDL, and LAG feels like they're still a few weeks away from really figuring it out with Mental in the lineup. And I think there's a world where they could actually turn this thing around with Mental, but it was obviously a little bit too late for them. Mental was their Hail Mary play to try to make a run here at stage 5. It didn't work out, obviously. I hope Mental stays in the league as well, because I'd love to see him kind of develop with the pro players around him and see what he can do heading into next year. But I guess we're gonna have to wait and see. And his teammates up next, Apathy. And I actually wanted to put Apathy in the D tier because I thought we saw a little bit of improvement from Apathy here in stage 5. At the end of stage 5, that series against New York, there was some really positive signs for the value that he brings to that team. And I really hope that he can find a squad again in this offseason as well. And again, we'll talk more about him and the rest of this LAG team in the offseason tier list as well. So one guy that's very difficult to grade, and I was really annoyed about having him in the B tier after having him in the A tier for multiple tier lists in a row, and that was Standy. And then he comes out and freaking dominates in stage 5, especially, of course, at the major. And so I have Standy in the A tier this time around. He's an absolute beast, and that is obvious now. Obviously, he came in and fried right when he got into the CDL. Then there was a little bit of a lull there for a while in stage 4 where you're like, okay, he's good for sure, but how good is he? The team's struggling. They're not really winning the matches. It was kind of hard to figure it out. But we saw them play a lot of Call of Duty at stage 5, and he is at the tippy top of the A tier, and I was definitely considering throwing him in the S tier for sure. He's right there with the best of them, and Standy, of course, can be the MVP player on a championship team now. We've seen it for sure, to say the least. So next guy up is Major Maniac, a teammate of his, and I have him in the B tier now. He was in the C tier last time, and we've definitely seen that improvement from him. And we really got to showcase Major Maniac with them playing so many matches here during stage 5 and seeing that leadership ability inside those listen-ins, and how important the play calling in S&D was, hearing from them and those players talking about Major Maniac and the role that Mike plays in bringing that level of communication and strategy to the team in S&D and how that's developed for them inside of stage 5. So all of that considered, Major Maniac's a really valuable player to that team, and he's definitely at least a B tier player, to say the least. So another guy who's really interesting here is a guy who was not on the tier list last time either because of the roster changes from LAT, and that's Draza. So I throw Draza in the B tier, but man, there is upside for Draza in the CDL. This guy could easily end up being an A tier, and he has S tier upside as a player. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with him in Roster Mania this year and what that could look like for the LAT team moving forward. Draza is a unit. Do not play this man on checkmate. He's a freaking beast. And I'm excited to see what Draza can do moving forward, as well as one of the true flexes in the CDL too. So speaking of flexes, although probably more of an AR nowadays, Silly is up next. I decided to put Silly in the D tier, a little bit higher than the E tier, obviously, than before. But I really do think Silly can still be a valuable part to a team, just like Apathy. But the situation just sucks. Their teamwork has just never figured it out this year. And that it would be where the questioning comes from, is like, okay, yeah, Silly and Apathy have been on the same team throughout the whole year. Then why hasn't it clicked for them? And they've had some tough situations, of course, with dropping Vivid and Chino, two really talented players as well. So I can see the argument for those guys being lower, but I think that both Apathy and Silly still deserve another chance in the CDL. prove it with a different roster and a different situation too. So the next guy up is the next guy up is also a really tough, interesting situation because of Clay leaving the squad and where they could be right now, and that's Mac for New York. I have him in the C tier now, so he dropped down from the B tier to the C tier. But I would have no problem with somebody still having him in the B tier, but it just gets a little bit crowded up there in the B. So somebody had to get knocked down at the end of the day. And without Clay, there was the aspect of maybe he's a little bit less lost or more lost and a little bit less coordinated than he should be. And the positioning seemed a little bit more inconsistent than before. So that's kind of where my questions arise now. We still need to see a little bit more COD from them at Champs, hopefully, maybe without Clay in the lineup moving forward too. So next guy up is the guy who is an absolute beast, and that was still confirmed in stage 5. There were some questions about this player, and I had him in the A tier last time, but he moved up to the S tier, and that is Insight. So Insight is an S tier player. This dude has proven it time and time again, and I felt bad about having him in the A tier last time. It was basically between like him and Arcides and like Hydra for the S tier last time. And so this time I'm like, yo, all of these guys are S tier players and they deserve to be up there. And so that's why I wanted to expand the S tier and make it a little bit more lenient to get inside, because these guys are all units and you can build your team around any of these players for sure. Insight is right there with the absolute best in the CDL. So speaking about players who have moved up and really changed their game and gotten better and better throughout the year, Scump is at least an A tier player. He's been playing some really good Call of Duty. S&D, and we saw the hard points even improve here in stage 5 as well. Really impressive stuff from him. Octane, you gotta be really excited for what Scump can bring to the table moving forward into Champs, and if they can actually make that run and level up and beat the Torontos of the world in the tournaments when it matters the most. And Toronto's been the Achilles heel for him so far in those majors, and we'll see what they can do heading into COD Champs. The next guy is a guy who I really felt bad about in the last tier list, because I had him in the D tier because he was just coming back into the lineup, but he's a perennially great, legendary player in the COD scene. So I had to at least move him up a little bit. So that's Slasher. I moved him up to the C tier now, and I wanted to, there's a part of me that wants to have him higher, but obviously we haven't seen it consistently yet in Cold War, but we know how good Slasher can be and the upside that he has as a player for sure. So Slasher's a beast and could move up even higher heading into the Roster Mania tier list, depending on how COD Champs goes for the LAT squad. So now we talked about the king of the COD already with Scump. We gotta talk about the Prince, and that is Envoy. He is in the A tier again. So he was in, actually, because of how bad stage 4 was for Envoy and for really Optic as a whole with the struggles that they had. And that was when people were like, should they make a roster change? Dumb people were saying that they should make a roster change. But Envoy played awesome in stage 5, and we saw the upside of Envoy again and again, specifically with like having those pop-off games inside Hardpoint and inside S&D. S&D's been a weird struggle for Envoy this year, trying to figure out that rhythm and how he should balance playing the flanks and being that ISO player. And so it's been interesting to see Optic kind of change out their strategies in S&D and let Envoy basically play the trade role a little bit better and play with a player and buddy up a little bit more and not be as isolated as much as he sometimes was previously. And that's helped him a lot. And I think overall leveled up Optic quite a bit. A good decision for them. And it's definitely really close with all those guys. He's at the top of the A tier for sure. So another guy who is not in the last video either, and that's Diamond Con, and he is going inside the D tier. So Diamond Con's been all over the place, where earlier on in the year he looked really good. I think I had him in the B tier, then he moved down to the C tier, then he got kicked off the team. Well, not kicked, but he got replaced, and now he's down in the D tier. He's kind of been all over the place. We'll see what happens at Champs, where maybe he can move up heading into the offseason. But for now, I think D makes a lot of sense for him. And then Zaptius is another guy who I wanted to talk about as well. But Zaptius, I think I'm going to put him down in the E tier for now, where it's just been a little bit disappointing for him on Paris, where we've seen some of the upside for him. He was in the D tier before and moving down to the E tier now, where we saw some upside at points earlier on in the year. And then, joining Paris, there was, again, some nice moments. especially inside control, but it hasn't been consistent enough for me to really be excited about it. And so that's why he dropped down into the E tier. So we have 2 players left, and one moved down 1 spot now. He is inside the B tier, and that's Asum. When that whole squad's there, I get really excited about him. So on an individual basis, it's interesting to grade these types of guys because individually with the right players around him, he can be an absolute unit. But when the timing's off, he's not as good at carrying a map or making the insane clutch plays like some of the guys up top are, like, you know, the Hydras or the Simps and Shotzies of the world, to make those clutch plays consistently. But Asum still is incredibly important to the success of New York. And he's really one of those X Factor players. When he's playing great, New York is as good as it gets. And that's why, you know, you want to keep Asum at least in the top half of these players because he is just that good at points for sure. And so the last player here is a player who definitely moved up. He had been playing some inconsistent, questionable Call of Duty earlier on in the year, and it was really inconsistent for Priesta earlier on. So he was in the C tier, which felt real bad in the last video, but we moved him up. He is now back in the B tier, rounding out our tier list this time around. And Priesta, of course, with Rocker, played such a good tournament. And you've got to be excited about Priesta, what he can bring heading into COD Champs as well, with the AR in hand, to say the least. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There's the tier list. If you guys enjoyed this video, of course, drop all your comments down below and let me know what I got wrong, what I got right, and all of your spicy comments about the best players in the CDL. And I'll be excited to see what you guys have to say. So without further ado, guys, like, comment, subscribe, share the video if you guys really enjoyed it. But as always, guys, I'm your boy SalvationsElite, and I am hyped for some COD Champs action. I already bought my tickets, so I'll see you guys there for sure. And guys, we will see you next time. I'm out.